She had been in that dining room for 2 years before he said it. 2 years of dinners, some formal, some quiet, some attended by guests whose names she had researched beforehand and whose preferences she had conveyed to the kitchen without being asked to, some attended by no one except the two of them, and the particular silence of a room that had learned, over time, to hold whatever the evening required of it. 2 years of selecting the table arrangements and approving the menus and managing the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who had understood from the beginning that the management was hers to do and had done it without requiring the management to be acknowledged. 2 years of being in that dining room, the reason the evenings worked. He said it on a Wednesday. The dinner was not a formal occasion. There were 6 guests, all known to him, most known to her, the kind of gathering that falls between the formality of a state dinner and the intimacy of a private supper, and therefore requires more active management than either, because the register is not established in advance and must be felt for continuously by whoever is attending to the room. She had been attending to the room. She had been attending to it with the same invisible, continuous precision she brought to all such evenings, monitoring the quality of the conversation, the comfort of the guests, the point at which Lord Alderton's enthusiasm for the parliamentary question was beginning to produce in the 3 guests to his right the particular careful blankness of people who have heard the argument before and have decided not to say so, and she had introduced a small and well-aimed observation about the county road proposals that had redirected the conversation without drawing attention to the redirection, and the evening had continued to flow, and she had continued to attend to its flowing, and she had said something. She would not be able to reconstruct precisely what later, because the content had been less important than the mechanism, which was the mechanism of a person managing a room. And he had said it, not loudly. He had said it in the particular tone of a man correcting a minor social irregularity, the tone that expected compliance rather than response, and what he had said was that she ought not to speak unless spoken to, as the guests had not addressed her. He had said it and returned to his own conversation, and the table had absorbed it with the uncomfortable efficiency of tables that have witnessed something requiring absorption, and she had received it with the stillness of someone who has been slapped in a public place, and has decided, in the 3 seconds available to her, that the most dignified response is no visible response at all. She had been managing the conversation on behalf of his guests, the guests he had invited, the evening she had organized. In the room she had been running for 2 years. She did not speak again that evening, not because she was complying with the instruction, because she was making a different kind of decision entirely, one that had nothing to do with that evening's table and everything to do with what came after it. She went upstairs when the guests had gone, and she sat in the chair by the window of her sitting room, and she was very still for a long time, and she made a decision that was not dramatic and was not impulsive, and was not the decision of a woman responding to a wound. It was the decision of a woman who had just been given, in the most public and most unambiguous form available, the accurate picture of how she was seen in that house, and who had decided to accept the accuracy and act on it. She would not dine with him again. Not that week, not that month, not in the foreseeable future of this particular arrangement. She was not going to perform the willingness to sit at a table where she had been told she existed at his discretion, because she did not exist at his discretion and had never existed at his discretion, and the performing of it would have been a lie she was no longer prepared to tell. This is the story of what followed that decision. It is also the story of what the decision revealed to a man who had spent 2 years in the company of someone exceptional, without understanding what exceptional meant until the space it left was visible. And it is the story of what it takes, and what it costs, for a person to move from the register of correction to the register of understanding, and whether the distance between those two registers can ever be crossed when the person who needs to cross it has waited too long to begin. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on the bell, because this story does not arrive at its meaning quickly, and the meaning is in the accumulation, and the accumulation begins here. Stay from the beginning. He was a man who had been, by any accounting, given every advantage that the world offers to men who arrive in it at the right address and the right moment. His education had been excellent. His position was significant. His intelligence was genuine, not the performed intelligence of a man who has learned to seem clever, but the actual kind that processes information quickly and holds its conclusions with the particular confidence of someone who has rarely been wrong about anything that his world required him to be right about. The world he had been required to be right about was a specific one. It was the world of estate management and political navigation, and the social architecture of a class that ran things and knew it, and organized its life around the maintenance of that knowledge. He was very good at all of it. He had been good at it for long enough that the goodness had become a form of assumption, not arrogance precisely, but the comfortable certainty of a man who has never encountered a domain in which his competence was insufficient, and who has accordingly never developed the particular and necessary skill of recognizing when a domain is operating outside his understanding. She was outside his understanding. He had not known this. He had believed in the comfortable way of men who assess situations through the lens of what they already know, that he understood her clearly, that she was a woman of acceptable intelligence and appropriate social capability who managed the household competently and attended the required occasions with suitable grace, and was, in all the ways that his world measured such things, a satisfactory match for his requirements. He had been using the word satisfactory in his assessment of her since the beginning, and the word had felt accurate to him, which was itself the evidence of how far outside his understanding she actually was, because satisfactory was not the word for what she was and had never been, and the gap between what he thought he was assessing and what was actually there was the gap that the Wednesday dinner had made irrevocable. He was not a cruel man in the deliberate sense. She had never accused him of that, not even in the privacy of her own thoughts, where the prosecution could have been more freely conducted. He was something more specific and, in many ways, more difficult to address, which was a man who had simply never been required to understand that the people in his life were not extensions of his own requirements, and who had accordingly never developed the mechanisms for that understanding, and whose failures were therefore not the failures of intention, but the failures of formation. He had been formed over 50 years of an unchallenged life into someone who divided the world into the things that worked and the things that required attention, and who had placed her, without examination, into the first category, and had been relating to her as a function of his household rather than as a person in it, And the Wednesday dinner had been, in this reading, not an aberration, but simply the first moment when the relating had been visible in a form that could not be absorbed and continued past. She had absorbed it for 2 years. She had absorbed it in the way of someone who understands that the absorbing is not agreement, but management, that every adjustment she made to the conditions she was operating in was not surrender, but the practical intelligence of someone who has decided to be effective inside the constraints available rather than to spend her energy fighting the constraints themselves. She had been effective. She had been extraordinarily effective in ways that he had not noticed, because the effectiveness had been designed to be invisible, had been designed to produce outcomes that looked natural rather than managed, that looked like things simply going well rather than like someone working very hard to make them go well. He had moved through 2 years of her work thinking he was simply moving through his own life. The dinner table had been the point at which she decided to stop making his life smooth enough for that belief to continue. She did not announce her decision. She did not present him with a statement or a condition or any form of the declaration that would have allowed him to manage the situation with the smooth efficiency he brought to all situations requiring management. She simply stopped. The next evening she dined in her sitting room, which was not an entirely unprecedented thing. She had occasionally done so during periods of indisposition, and she did so without comment and without explanation, and without asking whether this was acceptable, because she was not asking what was acceptable. She was making a different kind of determination, which was what was true, and what was true was that she was not going to sit at that table. The evening after that, she dined in the sitting room again, and the evening after that. By the fourth evening, a pattern had established itself, and patterns in a household as well managed as that one are noted before they are understood. Mrs. Reeve noted it first. Mrs. Reeve was the housekeeper, a woman of long service and precise observation who had been managing the domestic interior of the house since before either of them arrived in it, and who had the particular gift of people who have spent decades in close proximity to private lives of seeing what is actually happening rather than what is being presented, and what was actually happening was that the Duchess was not coming to dinner, and the not coming had the quality of a decision rather than a circumstance, and decisions of that quality in a household of that kind did not originate without cause. She noted it and said nothing to the Duke. This was itself a form of observation, the observation that there are things a housekeeper does not carry to her employer, because the carrying would require a conversation the housekeeper has understood is not hers to initiate. She managed the household arrangements to accommodate the new pattern, and she watched and she waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that the most important things in houses reveal themselves at their own pace and cannot be hurried. He noticed on the sixth evening he had come to the dining room at the usual hour and sat at the head of the usual table and found the chair to his left unoccupied for the third time in 6 days, and he had directed the question at the footman who was nearest, which was whether her Grace was unwell, and the footman had said that he believed her Grace was dining in her sitting room, and he had received this and continued with his meal, and said nothing further about it, because the not saying further was his method with things he had decided to understand later rather than now. Later, on that occasion, was a week and a half. He came to her sitting room on a Thursday evening, which was 11 days after the Wednesday dinner, and he knocked, which was in itself a small recalibration from his usual practice of entering rooms in his own house, without the formality of announcement. And she said, "Come in," and he came in and stood in the room with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conversation he has prepared for and is discovering that the preparation was insufficient. She was at the writing desk. She did not rise. She looked at him with the composed and entirely level attention that she brought to things that required accuracy, and she waited. He said he had noticed she had not been joining him for dinner. She said that was accurate. He waited for more. She did not provide more. He said he wanted to understand whether she was unwell. She said she was not unwell. He waited again. She returned her attention to the letter she had been writing, not as a performance of dismissal, but as the honest completion of a task she had been in the middle of, and she wrote another line before she looked up again and said that if he had a specific question, she would be glad to answer it. He said he had several questions. She said he should ask them. He asked whether her absence from the dinner table was connected to the Wednesday gathering. She said it was. He asked in what way. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone collecting themselves, but the quiet of someone deciding how precise to be. And she decided on full precision, because full precision was what the situation deserved and what she had decided to stop withholding. She said that she had spent 2 years managing the conversations at his dinner table in ways that had made his evenings function well, and that she had done this without being asked to, and without being thanked for it, and without it being acknowledged in any way that suggested he understood what she was doing or why, and that on the Wednesday evening he had said, in front of 6 guests, that she ought not to speak unless spoken to, and that this had told her, with more clarity than any previous evidence had provided, the exact register in which she existed in that dining room, which was the register of a person whose speech was conditional on his permission, and that she had decided she would not sit in a room on those terms. He received this without immediate response. She observed him receiving it with the expression of a man who has heard something he cannot argue with and knows he cannot argue with it, and is taking the time to understand what that means. He said he had not intended it in those terms. She said she understood that. She said she was telling him what it had communicated, not what he had intended, because communication and intention were 2 different things, and what she had been living inside for 2 years was the communication, not the intention, and the communication had been, whatever the intention was, the communication of a man who did not fully understand that she was a person whose participation in his life was not at his discretion. He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the quiet. He said he had been thinking, in the 11 days since Wednesday, about that evening, and that his thinking had been uncomfortable in a way that he was not accustomed to, and that the discomfort had produced an inventory that he had not expected, and that was not, he was finding, a particularly flattering one. She said she was glad the thinking had been uncomfortable. She said it in the tone that meant she was not being unkind, but was being accurate, and that accurate was what the moment required, and that she was not going to soften accuracy for his comfort. He said he understood. He said He would like to tell her what the inventory had produced, if she was willing to hear it. She said she was willing. He told her. He told it in the particular way of a man who has prepared something difficult and is saying it as precisely as he prepared it, without the usual smoothing mechanisms, without the architecture of self-defense that his fluency could easily have built if he had allowed it to. He said he had treated her as a component of his household rather than as a person in it, not with deliberate intention, but in the effective sense that was the only sense that mattered from her position, and that the Wednesday dinner had been the concentrated expression of a pattern he had not seen, because the pattern had been too comfortable for him to examine. He said comfortable was the operative word, and that he had been using her competence as a condition of his comfort without acknowledging either the competence or the cost, and that the cost was something he had not thought to ask about, and that the not asking was what he was most directly accountable for. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said it was more honest than she had expected. He said he was trying to be honest. She said she knew, and that the trying was visible, and that it mattered that it was visible, and that it would matter more over time if it continued to be visible rather than relapsing into the management of impression once the immediate discomfort had passed. He said he understood the distinction. She said she needed to know if he understood it in the practical sense, which was whether he was capable of being different in the specific ways that her returning to the dinner table would require, or whether what he was describing was the understanding of a man who had been made uncomfortable and was seeking to restore comfort without actually changing the conditions that had produced the discomfort in the first place. He said that was the most important question he had been asked in recent memory. She said she knew. He was quiet. She was quiet. The sitting room held them both in the particular quality of a space in which something is being decided that does not yet know what it is deciding. And she sat at the desk, and he stood near the door, and the November evening was dark at the window, and neither of them rushed the quality. He said he did not know if he was capable of the specific changes required, because he had not previously understood that changes of that kind were required, and that not knowing whether you are capable of something was different from being incapable of it, and that what he could offer was not a promise of transformation, but a genuine and specific intention to try, and that the trying would be visible rather than declared, and that if she was willing to observe the trying over time, he would submit to the observation and not attempt to manage it. She said she would think about it. He said he would wait. She said she needed him to understand that thinking about it was not the same as deciding, and that she was genuinely thinking rather than extending a courtesy, and that if the thinking produced a no, she needed him to receive the no as a complete answer rather than a position to be negotiated. He said he understood. He went back to his study. She returned to her letter. The thinking took 8 days. She thought honestly, which was how she did everything, without the distortions of either hope or the particular pride that makes a person refuse what they actually want, because wanting it feels like weakness. She thought about what he had said, and what it had cost him to say it, and whether the cost was the cost of genuine reckoning or the cost of uncomfortable management dressed as genuine reckoning. And she thought about the difference between those two things and how to tell them apart. And she thought about what returning to the dinner table would require, and what conditions would need to be present for the returning to be something other than a return to what had been. And by the 8th day, she had a clear and honest picture of all of these things, and had reached the conclusion that the picture produced. The conclusion was that she was willing to return, not to the dining room immediately, not to the performance of a return that would allow both of them to resume the previous arrangement with the Wednesday dinner smoothed over like bad weather that has passed. She was willing to return to something she did not have a name for yet, something that was not yet built and had not previously existed, and that would have to be built from the actual ground of what they were, rather than from the assumption of what he had thought they were. She wrote him a note. It was not long. It said that she had finished thinking, and that she was going to describe what she needed, and that she needed him to hear it as a description rather than a negotiation, because she was not negotiating, and she was not presenting conditions to be met on her behalf. She was telling him what was true about what was required, and what was required was this. She was going to speak in whatever room she was in, and she was going to speak in the full exercise of her intelligence and her observation and her capacity for the management of difficult social situations. And she was going to do this because it was who she was, and because it was part of what she brought to every room she occupied, and she was not going to do it conditionally on whether she had been spoken to first, and she was not going to manage it in ways designed to make him comfortable with the speaking, and she needed him to understand, before she returned to any shared table, that the speaking was not something that existed at his permission and had never existed at his permission, and was not available for recategorization into something that did. She said that if he could understand this and demonstrate that he understood it in practice rather than in statement, she was willing to find out what they might be to each other when both of them were present in the room as what they actually were. She sent the note. He came to her sitting room the following morning, before she had finished her tea, which was itself a change from the usual mechanisms of their communication, which were managed through appropriate channels and appropriate hours. He came himself at an inappropriate hour, without a prepared speech, with the slightly undone quality of a man who has read something in the night that has not let him sleep, and has come because the coming felt more honest than waiting. He said he had read the note. She said she had expected he had. He said he wanted to ask her something. She said he should ask. He said the note had described something she had been bringing to every room she was in, which was the full exercise of her intelligence and her observation and her capacity for management. And he wanted to know how long she had been bringing it. She looked at him. He said he was asking because he understood, reading the note, that what she was describing was not something she had recently acquired or recently decided to exercise, and that if it was something she had been bringing to every room, she had been bringing it to his rooms, and that meant she had been bringing it to his dining room for the 2 years she had been there. She said yes. He said he had not known. She said she knew. He sat down in the chair near the window, which he had not been invited to sit in, and which she did not object to him sitting in, and he said that he had spent the night reading the note and thinking about what it described, and trying to understand the gap between what she had been doing in his rooms and what he had understood her to be doing, and that the gap was very large, and that the largeness of it was its own kind of reckoning, not just about the Wednesday dinner, but about all the dinners before it, about the 2 years of dinners in which she had been managing the room, and he had been sitting at the head of it, believing the room was simply running well. She said the room had been running well. He said he understood now that it had been running well because she had been running it. She said yes. He said he had been speaking to Aldous the previous week about the estate accounts, and that Aldous had mentioned in passing that her Grace had been reviewing the tenant situation in the East Quarter, and that he had asked Aldous when this had begun, and that Aldous had said it had begun shortly after her arrival, and that her Grace had been the primary point of contact for the East Quarter for some time. He said he had not known this either. She said there was a great deal he had not known. He said he was aware of that now, and that the awareness was recent and not comfortable, and that he was not going to pretend that the awareness transformed him immediately into someone who had possessed the awareness all along, because that would be the managed version of what was actually happening, which was that he was a man who had just discovered the full dimensions of his own ignorance about his own household, and was in the process of sitting with that discovery without trying to make it smaller than it was. She looked at him for a long moment. She said that sitting with it without making it smaller was precisely what she had needed to see before any other conversation could usefully occur. He said he was sitting with it. She said she could see that. She poured him tea, which was the first gesture she had made toward him since the Wednesday dinner, and she did it without ceremony and without it meaning more than it was, which was the gesture of a person in a room who has a pot of tea and another person present, and it was also the first unrequested thing she had done for him in 11 days, and they both understood what it was without either of them saying so. He drank it. She finished hers. The morning was gray, and the sitting room was warm, and outside the window the grounds were in the particular condition of late November, stripped and clear and waiting, and she looked at them and said that she would return to dinner when she was ready, and that she would know when she was ready, and that she was not going to tell him when that was because it was not information he needed in advance. It was simply something that would happen when the conditions were what they needed to be. He said he understood. He said that he was going to ask her a question every morning, beginning this morning, and that the question was not going to be about the household or the estate or any of the functional matters that had been the primary content of their exchanges for 2 years. He said the question was going to be about her, specifically, and what she was thinking about, or reading, or working on, or attending to, and that the asking was not a performance of interest, but the beginning of an attempt to understand who she was in the full sense of that phrase, not the functional sense that had been his previous operating register. She looked at him with the clear and precise attention she brought to things that deserved accuracy. She said that was a considerable change from his previous practice. He said he knew. She said she would answer the questions if they were genuine. He said they would be genuine. He asked the first one. It was about the tenant situation in the East Quarter, which she had been the primary point of contact for, and the question was specific enough to tell her that he had actually spoken to Aldous and was actually trying to understand what had been happening there, and she answered it in full, with the full exercise of what she knew, and he listened with the quality of attention she had described in her note, the quality of a person for whom what she was saying was the actual point, rather than the background noise of a room he was otherwise managing. The conversation that followed lasted an hour. It was the longest conversation they had had since the early months of the arrangement, when the arrangement had still been new enough to generate the particular attentiveness of novelty. And it was considerably more honest than those early conversations, because the novelty of those months had been, she understood now, the novelty of two people performing for each other, rather than two people actually present with each other. This was not that. This was two people in a room on a gray November morning, one of them trying something he had not previously tried, and the other watching to see whether the trying was real. She returned to dinner on a Tuesday, not because she had decided the conditions were fully met, because conditions of the kind she had described were not met quickly or in their totality, but because the Tuesday felt different from the previous Tuesdays in a specific and legible way, which was the way of something being genuinely attempted, rather than comfortably assumed. He had been asking the morning question every day for 9 days when the Tuesday arrived, and the questions had been genuine, in the sense that their answers had produced follow-up questions that could only have been generated by someone who had actually listened to the answer, and the follow-up questions had produced a cumulative picture of what her days actually contained that he had not previously possessed, and the picture had been, she observed, received with the quality of genuine interest, rather than the quality of a man performing interest in order to produce a particular response. She came downstairs on Tuesday evening in the particular state of a woman who has made a decision and is inhabiting it without performance, and she took her chair to the left of his at the table that she had been setting mentally for 2 years and had not set for 9 days, and the table had a quality it had not had since Wednesday, which was the quality of a table that both people at it were actually attending. He said when she sat down that he was glad she had come. She said she knew. He asked because the asking was what he was practicing, what she was thinking about. She told him. The table absorbed it the way tables absorb things when the people at them are genuinely present in the room, which was without drama and without the particular quality of a table waiting for something to go wrong, simply with the quiet ease of a meal between two people who are attending to each other. The staff noticed, in the precise and silent way that staff notice things, and said nothing, because the saying would have required them to name what they were noticing, and naming it would have changed its quality, and the quality was better left unnamed, which was that the dining room had returned to a register it had briefly had in the first weeks of the arrangement, and had not had since, the register of a room in which two people were both actually in it. Mrs. Reeve observed the change in the kitchen accounts for the following week, and said nothing. She observed that the morning correspondence had begun to include a new thread of exchange, brief and practical, questions from his study directed to her sitting room, and answers returned in the same channel, a working correspondence of the kind that exists between two people who are both attending to the same domain from different positions. And she said nothing about this either, because saying would have been the wrong instrument for what she was observing. What she was observing did not require saying. It was simply the particular quality of a house that has stopped running on one engine and started running on 2, and the difference was visible in the quality of the running, and the quality was better, and that was sufficient. He asked her on a December morning, 6 weeks after the Wednesday dinner, a question that was different from the daily questions in its register, which was whether she would tell him what the 2 years had been like. Not the management of the 2 years, not the contents of what she had been doing, but what the 2 years had been like from inside them. And he asked it in the tone of a man who understands he is asking for something he has not earned the right to receive easily, and who is asking anyway, because not asking would be the previous method, and the previous method was what had produced the Wednesday dinner. She was quiet for a long time. He waited with the patience he had been developing, the patience of someone learning that waiting without managing the wait was itself a form of presence. She said the 2 years had been, in the practical sense, the most demanding and interesting work she had done, and that she had found the work genuinely absorbing and had found in it a quality of purpose that she had not expected to find when she arrived, and that she had done the work well, and knew she had done it well, and had found the knowing sufficient for a long time. He said for a long time. She said yes. She said that the sufficient had become insufficient, and that the insufficiency had accumulated quietly and without announcement until the Wednesday dinner had given it a form that was visible, and that she could not continue absorbing, and that the form it had taken was the form of a man telling her that her speech existed at his permission, and that this was, for someone who had been doing what she had been doing, the most precise possible expression of how invisible the doing had been. He received this without deflecting. She said that what she needed was not to be thanked for what she had done, because gratitude after the fact for invisible work was not the thing that would have prevented the Wednesday dinner from happening. She said what she had needed was to be seen while she was doing it, which was different from being thanked for it afterward, which was the difference between presence and retrospective recognition, and that she had needed the presence rather than the recognition and had not received the presence, and that the decision to stop dining with him had been the decision of a woman who had finally accepted that the presence was not going to arrive unless she created the conditions that made its absence visible. He said he understood the distinction. She said she believed he did. He said he was going to ask something else, and that it was the question he had been working toward since the December morning began, and that he was asking it without preparation, because prepared questions were the method of a man who is managing toward a particular answer, and he was trying to stop managing. She said he should ask. He said he wanted to know whether she was staying, not whether she was returning to dinner, which she had already answered in practice, whether she was staying in the fuller sense, which was whether what was happening in the house over the past 6 weeks had changed her understanding of what the house could be, and whether the changing of that understanding had been sufficient to make her want to be part of what it was becoming. She looked at him for a long moment in the December morning light of her sitting room, and she thought about what staying meant, and she thought about what it had meant before the Wednesday dinner and what it meant now, and the difference between those two meanings was the same difference she had been tracing since the beginning of this accounting, which was the difference between staying, because the conditions did not yet require leaving, and staying, because the conditions were genuinely worth being in. She said that the conditions were different now from what they had been. He said he knew. She said she was staying because the difference was real and because she had been watching it for 6 weeks with the clear and precise attention she brought to things that deserved to be accurately assessed, and because the assessment had produced the conclusion that what was happening in the house was genuinely different from what had been happening before, and that genuinely different was a thing worth being part of. She said she was not saying it was finished, or complete, or resolved. She said she was saying it was real. He said real was enough. She said she knew it was enough because real was what she had needed all along, and what she had been demonstrating for 2 years in the hope of receiving in return, and that receiving it now, imperfectly and at cost to both of them, was still the kind of receiving worth noting. He said he was noting it. She said she was glad. The dining room on the Tuesday evenings that followed had a quality that it had not had in the 2 years before the Wednesday dinner, or rather, it had a quality it had always been capable of having and had never had, which was the quality of a room attended to by two people who were both present in it as what they actually were, both contributing to what the room became, rather than one person creating the conditions for the other's comfort, and receiving the creating as simply the condition of things. She still managed the conversations. She was better at it than he was, and they both knew it. But the managing was different now in one specific and essential way, which was that the managing was seen, not always and not perfectly, but seen in the way that makes a difference, which is the way of one person actually understanding what another person is doing rather than simply receiving its results. And the understanding was visible in the quality of his attention on the evenings when the management was most visible. And the quality of his attention was, she found, the thing that changed the register of every room they were both in. He spoke to her at the Alderton Spring Gathering in April, a dinner of 30 guests where she was doing what she had always done, which was attending to the room with the full precision of her capability. And he leaned toward her at a moment between the second and third courses and said, quietly and without performance, and without any particular audience, that she had just done something with the conversation at the far end of the table that had prevented what appeared to be an impending social disaster, and that he had noticed it, and that he wanted her to know he had noticed it. She looked at him. He was not performing noticing. He was simply noting with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has learned to pay attention and is reporting what attention produces. And the matter-of-fact quality was better than any elaboration would have been, because matter-of-fact was the register of someone who sees this as simply what is true, rather than as something that requires acknowledgment for its own performance. She said thank you. He said it was accurate. They returned to the dinner. The table continued. The room did not require her to be invisible in order to function, and she was not invisible, and the room was better for it, and both of them knew it, and the knowing was shared rather than the knowledge of one person carrying what the other had not thought to look for. She had refused to dine with him for 9 days, and the 9 days had produced this, not a resolution and not a recovery of something that had previously existed, because what was now in that dining room had not previously existed, had had to be made from the actual ground of two people finally attending to each other, and the making had cost something real. She would not have said the cost was too high. She was too precise for that kind of accounting, too careful with what things actually cost and what they actually produce. What she would have said was that the cost was the cost, and that what it produced was worth the cost, and that the dinner table on a Tuesday evening in April, with 30 guests and a conversation that ran smoothly because two people were both attending to its running, was the kind of thing that could not have been produced more cheaply. Leave a like if this story found you where you needed it. It tells us that these stories deserve to exist. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the bell so the next one arrives from the beginning, because they are always experienced differently when you have been there from the start. And if you know someone who has been managing rooms that refuse to see the management, share this with them today. What they have been doing is real. What they deserve is to be seen doing it. And some people, given the right kind of difficulty at the right moment, finally learn to look.